boost, kind of gets them over the ledge there. In New York, which is a very anti-federalist state, New York's ratification convention is fascinating because when it convenes, the anti-federalists have a 2/3 majority. And Hamilton, who's a federalist, knows that the goose is cooked if they vote too early, so he uses every trick in the book to avoid a quick vote. All right? And while that's going on, they're waiting for news from New Hampshire, they're waiting for news from Virginia, and all sorts of backroom deals are getting cut about who's going to hold office. It's kind of interesting, right, that the first federal capital under the new government is New York City. Wonder how that happened, right? You know, but there you go. Yes, sir.
I was always under the impression that the states where ratification would be a tough sell to the southern states.
Yes.
And this proves that wrong. There's New York and Massachusetts in particular. Is there a common thread among the anti-federalist feelings that led to such close votes?
Yeah, well, it's not simply geographic. It's certainly not just the north-south divide. A lot of historians of ratification will say it's an east-west divide. That the further you get away from eastern cities, from commercial agriculture, so the Tidewater region of Virginia, where people are growing tobacco, using slave labor, exporting it to international markets. In the lowland Carolinas, where we're growing rice and exporting it, you know, these slave owners care about U.S. credit abroad because they deal with international trade. As you get further west, as you go into the Piedmont region of Virginia, as you hit this area, Appalachian Mountains and so forth, more people are subsistence farmers. They are not particularly, they engage in subsistence local economies. So they are not federalists. And so that is a common divide, that east-west divide. Generally speaking, people who were debtors tended to be anti-federalists. People who were creditors tended to be federalists. And that makes sense because people are creditors of the federal government. They own stocks and bonds. The federal government needs to pay off.
So in Massachusetts and New York, would be the people from the western side of the states that made this.
Yes. During the New York Ratification Convention, there are some, the folks who live in New York City in the lower Hudson Valley, which is Federalist area, actually talk about seceding from the rest of the state so that they can go into the Union if the rest of the state votes against the Constitution. In Massachusetts, western Massachusetts was where Shays' Rebellion happened.
Did the general populace understand these rather complicated issues in those days better than the general populace does these days?
That is an excellent question. And one of the reasons I like studying history, and one of the reasons I would encourage anybody, regardless of their walk of life, to study history, is one of the things you quickly learn is it disabuses you of this notion that all of history, the purpose of all of history, has been to arrive at this moment where we are the smartest, bestest people in the world, right? Very quickly you realize we really are no smarter. In fact, we may be less smart than other people at other times. And when you look at the caliber of debate in these ratification conventions, for example, people were certainly more eloquent. During the New York ratification debates, one of the ways Hamilton stalled for time was he got up and he gave speeches that lasted several days. And there were newspaper reporters who wrote these things down and then published them, and people, gathered them up to read them as soon as they were off the press. And he's making all sorts of allusions to ancient Greece and ancient Rome and Sparta, and he's talking about these finer points of classical government and stuff. And now, that's not saying that some guy pushing a plow, along the Hudson River has read up on all that stuff. But nonetheless, people with a certain education are able to follow it. And generally speaking, this is a very literate nation. It's probably the most literate nation in the world at this time. Among free whites, literacy is pretty much 100% in New England. As you move further south, it decreases, but still, well over 50% of the free white population is literate. Newspapers are widely circulated. So, yes, I think they are speaking of the era in which they lived.
More to be able to speak to my grandchildren and so forth, to be able to kind of put names they would know.
Right. Yeah. And it does, and sides seem to change, right? The democratic ideas that are embraced, people that in the Democratic Party who embrace and articulate certain ideas today, well, wasn't that what Republicans were saying, 100 years ago? Jefferson, wasn't Jefferson the Democrat? Wasn't Jackson the Democrat? Didn't they like small government? Well, why do Republicans like small government? And because it's not, that straightforward of, two parallel tracks just following each other through American history. People cross and interchange. It's more like a plate of spaghetti moving in and out. But you can follow the strands. And the other thing that's interesting about, I'm not one of these people who comes in here and says, oh, the founding fathers bow down before them, gods among men. We could never have those again. But they were kind of a different group. Certainly they were flawed human beings and all that. But when you look at the raw brain power that's involved with people like Madison and Hamilton, Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, right? It is interesting to me that they lived in a society in which the very smartest people were public figures and politicians. And one criticism of American politics today is it tends to scare away people whose talents would be very usefully applied there because they're not willing to submit themselves to the scrutiny, or they find that their interests are better served by becoming entrepreneurs or doing academia or something like that. That's a structural difference.
You don't have to comment on this, but I'm sure you're familiar with the argument that the founding fathers were almost all Masons,
Yes.
and that the ideals of the founding fathers were the ideals of the Masons in the Masonic order.
Right. Well, certainly many of them were Masons, and certainly a lot of the symbols and imagery they borrowed for things like the currency and so forth had Masonic roots. But I don't think the fact that they were Masons has any significant impact on their political ideology. It's like saying that, well, they all had two legs too, right? But the fact that they were bipedal doesn't necessarily explain their political ideology. The fact that many of them were veteran officers of the Continental Army, I think, is very significant. Generally speaking, veteran officers of the Continental Army were Federalists. And that's significant because they believed in a strong military and you needed a strong federal government to do that. Generally speaking, leaders of the Democratic Republicans, when they served in the military, served in militias. Well, that makes sense too because militias were state organizations. And, and so, see what I'm saying? So I don't think that the fact that they're Masons is as important as some of these other common features that they have. And also, while we're on the topic, sometimes people say to me, is it true the Iroquois wrote the Constitution? That there was this influence of Indians, Native American political ideology? And the answer to that is no.